All right, here goes nothing. I'm Jacob, and I've always been really passionate about stories and entertainment. Anything that like immerses me in a world that I can explore or be a part of, and I can learn new things, get perspective about my own life and what it all means, I guess. Um, that's always been really important to me, even as a kid. Like when I was 12 years old, I used to write these horrible short stories that never went anywhere, and I would always just kind of start with something I thought was really cool, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I've always been really fascinated with books and video games and movies. I wanted to write screenplays for a long time, so I just figure why not get familiar with talking about it, and then maybe one day I can contribute in some kind of larger conversation. Um, maybe people would be interested in what I have to say at some point. But to do that, I have to start somewhere, and I have to practice. And so I'm just gonna jump in and do it for now. So today, I'm going to talk about um, a topic that is very dear to my heart, and that is The Legend of Zelda. And this is a subject that I'd like to maybe get into on a deeper level at some point in some form or other. But for now, I'm just gonna kind of go over some talking points and just hash it out. So, what am I talking about? I'm gonna talk about this idea that that Link is that Link needs to be silent and he shouldn't be talking in the video games or in any adaptations, any films, anything. So this is actually, and this, it may surprise you that people feel so strongly about this, but this goes way back. And I actually have some notes written down about it. So let me just take a peek here. I think it was like 2005. I think, 2005, waiting for Twilight Princess to come out, I would go on to forums and be talking to people about it. And people were very much against the idea of Link having dialogue in game. They have for a long time, and I feel like that's probably still the mainstream stance on it. And one reason I feel that way is because of an IGN article that resurfaced recently. So it was originally in it was published in July 21st, 2018, and then they brought it back because of people being in talk to do the Legend of Zelda TV series. So this is about an interview with the director of the Metal Gear Solid movie, and he was asked what he would do, like how he would make a Legend of Zelda film. And this is what IGN mentions in the article that he said. He said, the thing about Zelda is not Lord of the Rings, right? You cannot forget how quirky and bizarre Zelda is. I agree with that. That's true. He also said, I think you need to find a way to actually fuse the traditional Zelda and the very new Zelda, which I also agree with. If you make a film based on these classic, games, you're not going to be able to do that one-to-one, and it's not going to be the same. It's going to be a completely new product, and you have to present it that way. And so he's talking, I assume that what he's talking about is like taking the traditional games and you're creating this new product, but it still feels like it's the same, but it still presents itself as like a different entity. He goes on, I think you have to find a way to very intensely fuse the pure, just sort of fantasy of the Ocarina of Time and the link to the past. But then I think you need to find a way to incorporate the newer pseudo tech stuff, the lasers and Tron lines that happen in the newer games, but in a way that's not overwhelming. On top of that, oh, this is IGN. I'll just read what the next bit of what the director said. I actually fully think, this is the director, Link should not speak the entire film. I would do a film where he is a silent protagonist. Yeah, so let's talk about that for a bit. Why would we want to keep Link silent? Well, I'll just tell you why. Actually, first, what I'll do is I'll tell you why, some of the reasons why people say Link should be silent, or the main one. So there's this idea that the reason that Link is silent is because he's quote unquote. This is attributed to Shigeru Miyamoto, who I believe was the director of the original game. I say believe, I'm almost like 100% certain he directed it. So like, he was saying that supposedly that Link is like the link to the character, and so that's why he's a blank slate. And so it's like the player basically projects himself onto the avatar that is Link. Couple issues with that. Couple things to talk about there. Normally that is the case in games. Like games normally aren't very, particularly like in the NES era, they're not particularly complex. Like the NES, SNES era is known for like large scale JRPGs where it's a fantasy world and it's a little bit complicated and there's like lots of characters and things like that. And a lot of later JRPGs, like it kind of evolved from that. But if you play the original Final Fantasy, it's mostly like a pretty straightforward game. It's all about the gameplay. And when you talk to people, when you have conversations with people, it's less about like furthering the story and more about the mechanics, like what's going to get you where, how do you play the game? And the original Legend of Zelda is also this way. Even A Link to the Past, I would say, is very much in that vein, where characters mainly exist to tell you where to go next in this fantasy world. And really, that's fine. I'm okay with that to a degree. I like the Metroidvania style gameplay of like you're interacting with stuff and then you interact, and and the reason you do that is just to basically get to the next part. Ori and the Blind Forest is a pretty good example of this. There is a lot of story to Ori and the Blind Forest, but most of it is just people trying to get you to go to the next place and just exploring the world. And that's fine. Obviously, like it is a game, but like we're talking about like the context of that in narrative. So things are changing a little bit when you bring the conversation into that space. So, so for example, games are more narrative driven now. Like, yeah, a lot of it is still gameplay, but like if you play Breath of the Wild, there's a lot of dialogue in that game. They really try to create it, make it much more of a story in some senses. Like, yeah, it's an open world, but they have lots of cutscenes, lots of memories you can find in the game where people have a lot of fully voiced dialogue where they're expressing like the things that they're going through. And that's all narrative. None of that is information that is pertinent to you as a player being successful in the game. It's all about the world. And Ocarina of Time had a lot of stuff like that too. There were a lot of details that playing the game and exploring and talking to people, you found out things that weren't pertinent to being successful in the game. They were all about fleshing out the world and making it feel real. And you can see that as that's kind of the trend that existed after Ocarina of Time going forward. So, but what didn't change was that even though all these other characters besides Link they had their own dialogue and things that they had to say and things that were going through, Link never did talk. And not in a way that like the player had access to. Sometimes there were interactions that Link had, if I remember this correctly, particularly in Wind Waker, where it seemed like he said something, but you, the player, didn't really hear what he said. It was like other characters just interacting and Link communicating somehow, but you don't hear or see any of his actual dialogue. You know, it's like, and that's kind of necessary in order for this world to work. Like the implication is that Link is communicating with people. That's how he exists in this world. It just doesn't make sense otherwise. But what am I talking about? Okay, so trying to make sure I don't get sidetracked here. It's pretty easy to do. Okay, so Link is the link between the player and the game. Let's talk about that concept. Supposedly, as I was saying, it's attributed to Shigeru Miyamoto. I haven't been able to track down the actual source of this, and I've heard from other people that they haven't either. So I would be very interested to know where this idea came from, but I'm not 100% sure that Shigeru Miyamoto even said it. But if he did, let's kind of talk about that, because that is how game design works. Like your character, your avatar is the connection between you and the game world, because that's how you make things happen. What I don't understand is the implication of the argument, which seems to be that suspension of disbelief requires a silent protagonist, because depending on the context, the opposite is true. For example, like take Jak and Daxter. Jak and Daxter was a collectathon where you run through different stages, exploring, killing bosses. In theory, having a voiced protagonist with a story, an arc, and character drama could have bogged things down level to level. There's a cast of quirky side characters, and I'm saying this like you could make this argument. I don't necessarily agree, but you can make this argument. You could say that there's a cast of quirky side characters. They primarily exist to give the game context and to tell Jak what to do next. Jak doesn't need to necessarily respond in these situations. He just needs to go do the thing, right? So you could make that argument. But then Naughty Dog made Jak 2, and Jak 2 was completely different. It was similar in that there are collectathon elements, but the way that the story happens, it's very narrative driven. Naughty Dog wanted to create an open world with living, breathing characters and a plot and conflict. And they wanted to create an immersive and believable universe. And so in order to do that, they gave Jak a voice. They made him a person, and they made a character that voiced how he felt about different situations that he was in, and had an arc. He had drama. He had a narrative. As far as a lot of people are concerned, it was a huge step up for the franchise. It made the world so much more real. And again, like I don't understand this argument. So like when I'm playing Uncharted 2 and Nathan Drake, the game avatar, makes a quip and says something to Sully in a way that's both entertaining and expressive of Nathan's character, the situation, playing off of who Sully is, like those characters, like their chemistry, like that doesn't break my immersion. That's part of how the immersion works in the first place. The Legend of Zelda is not Elder Scrolls. Link is not a role play or some expression of who you are. He's not a customizable character that you build from the ground up. You don't get to come up with a backstory for Link. Every Link is their own person. And that's like one of the main things too, is like every Link has his own arc and his own thing that he's going through. And so to say, and if he were able to talk, they would all say completely different things. And like, just to give some examples. So Ocarina of Time's Link is plagued by prophetic nightmares that make him feel isolated and trapped within his own destiny. That's my perspective of it anyway. There's probably a lot of really cool like visual essays where people go into much more detail than that, and I love those types of videos. But like that's one way of looking at it, and that's kind of like how I look at it. He lives with the Kokiri even though he knows he's not one of them. The game stresses that every Kokiri has a fairy and he doesn't. Because of this and because of his prophetic dreams, it makes sense that he would latch on to Zelda and care about her, partly because of the dreams that he's had about her, but also because she's part of his transitioning out of the world of the Kokiri and into his world of adulthood and responsibility. Wind Waker's Link, somewhat similarly, starts out a boy wearing blue pajamas, he's forced to wear the traditional green tunic, modeled after what the hero of time wore as part of his people's custom. It's almost like a rite of passage, marking the transition between boyhood and manhood in his family. To Link, said green tunic, the representation of responsibility, is annoying and uncomfortable, but when his little sister is kidnapped by the giant bird pirate thing in the game, he keeps the tunic on, seemingly adopting the role that the hero of time had. As he leaves on his voyage to go find his sister, he also takes an heirloom in his family, the Hylian shield. And there's this weirdly sad yet funny moment when the ship is taking off and Link is waving goodbye to his family and friends who are gathered on the shore, probably the only people he's ever known in his life. And he has the most depressed look on his face. It's kind of messed up. And Tetra, the ship's captain, gives him a hard time for it. She knows that things are going to get hard, and Link doesn't seem quite mature enough to handle it yet. So like that's a complex, like that's not like super complicated, but it's complex in the sense that Link is dynamic. He's experiencing different emotions, and those emotions are like clearly visible. So like, what is the difference between that and him actually speaking? Well, dialogue is much more specific. And I think that's part of what this comes down to is like, if it's kind of like when you have like an oil light on in your car and you just pull over and you just unplug the light, or like a check engine light. Like, yeah, okay, you can shut it off, but it doesn't fix the problem, you know? If you're experiencing symptoms and you take something to like for that, like you're still probably sick with something. It's just the symptoms are still there, and that's kind of the issue. That's kind of my perspective on the idea of trying to make Link a silent protagonist in a movie or even in future games is potentially, but particularly in a movie. I'm talking about a movie for now. So the problem is that Link is a person. He's a character, and it's going to be a challenge to represent that when you're like that guy was saying, fusing the traditional with the new. That's going to be difficult. And representing Link in a way that is faithful is going to be difficult. But not giving him a voice, what that really comes down to is it doesn't fix the problem. In fact, the problem will still exist because it comes down to an understanding and ability to adapt Link as a character. And if you're uncomfortable with him talking, then it's probably not going to be easy to adapt him in general. Like, you're probably going to have a hard time depicting him in any kind of way that makes him seem relatable as a human being. That's just what it comes down to. And so it's like the problem of not being able to depict him like up here with like dialogue, with like speech, which is like a higher form of like reaction and response to situations that a character would have, right? Then like depicting this other stuff too, it's like it's a representation of there's the problem down here with how people are coming at it. And it's like the dialogue is just the most visible problem. Everything else is still going to be there. It all comes down to being able to depict Link. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. Hopefully I'm getting better at doing this, just kind of like hashing things out and talking about it. I feel like rewatching this, I may notice like more errors than it seemed like I was having. But I used to say like a lot more and yeah and like stutter a bunch. I did it again. But hopefully there's a little bit less of that. It's a little bit easier to follow and listen to. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else I really want to get into on this for now, for just like the basic, like going over it. All the different talking points. I suppose if this were an actual live stream, this is the point where I'd want to like look at the live chats and like talk about what people are saying, but there are no live chats because nobody's watching me. All right. Well, I'm Jacob, and this has been fun. I'll have to come up with something to talk about next. Until then.